Good. Well, as the trial of Thomas Cranmer draws to a close, an accusation is made against him, which piques his interest. It is 1555, 3 years since he composed the first draft of the Book of Common Prayer, and he faces two charges: repudiating papal authority and denying transubstantiation. It is to the latter charge which the accusation is made, that he has taught three different doctrines of the Eucharist. Quite wrong, he says. He's only been teaching two different doctrines of the Eucharist. A diversity of opinion within the Church of England as to the nature of our Eucharistic theology has been present. And yet the common ground on which Church of England ministers have met has remained unchanged. That the Eucharist, along with the exposition of God's Word, is a central constituting factor in the life of God's Church. Article 19 makes it clear that without baptism and regular Eucharistic communication, a gathering of faithful men and women remains just that, gathered and faithful, but not a church. The question then must arise, what of lay-led church plants? Canon B12 is clear that one of the two constitutive factors needed for gathering this faithful church, Holy Communion, is a ministry explicitly limited to those who have been ordained priest by episcopal ordination. In other words, it would seem that a lay person cannot lead a Church of England's church plant in the same capacity that an ordained minister can. This simple statement of the canonical realities, however, does not seem to deter the charismatic evangelical tradition in the church from seeking lay-led church plants, specifically 10,000 lay-led church plants by 2030. Unless specific structures for sacramental provision are instituted, it is conceivable that a significant proportion of worshippers within an Anglican diocese may be part of a lay-led church by 2030. And thus have no expectation of regular Eucharistic communion. To date, no specific structures for sacramental provision have been proposed. The theme of this conference is participation, and so here is the participation problem. How can lay-led churches participate in the sacramental worshipping life of the Anglican communion? I'll propose a short-term fix and a long-term solution. However, the main body of this paper is asking why sacramental worship should be and is important for a charismatic evangelical church plant. And it's notable that the vast majority of church plants sit within this stream, arriving out of either the HTB or the New Wine networks. So the case may be made that the Book of Common Prayer, our foundational liturgical document, only stipulates that Holy Communion is required thrice yearly. It was not until the parish communion movement of the 1920s and 30s that Sunday Eucharistic worship became understood as the central gathering point for the Lord's people. So those who extend the argument that it is in keeping with our Anglican tradition to receive communion far less frequently than weekly have a firm ground for this assertion. However, I argue that the charismatic tradition that seeks to dispense with such regular communion is the very tradition which has so much to benefit from regular Eucharistic worship. That for the charismatic tradition, there is a particular value that sacramental worship brings when it comes to our theology and participation. So 3 points then, like any good evangelical charismatic sermon. Why should we, which will be the longest by far, how can we, and what must change? Firstly then, why should we? There's been a long expressed concern that charismatic Christianity is, in essence, an emotionally driven expression of faith. Nigel Scotland, writing in the Journal of Pentecostal Theology, describes it like this: it is by very nature intuitive rather than rational, and experience-based rather than text-based religion. Its central concerns are with personal well-being, feelings, therapies, and empowerment. The Pentecostal theologian Frank Macchia and the late charismatic theologian Thomas Smale both recognise this critique that's been made of their respective traditions, and they make considerable attempts to refute it. Macchia says that by stressing that spirit baptism and tongues is for the empowerment of the church, it is a witness for Christ, Pentecostals have departed significantly from conservative evangelical preoccupation with subjective conversion. They both follow the same logic, that the charismata are objective realities, not subjective experiences. However, the continued attention by charismatic theologians to this concern reveals that there must be something of substance in the criticism to which we must attend. I believe that the same desire for the objective realities of worship, rather than merely subjective realities of worship, is seen in the contemporary focus on spiritual disciplines. If you know anything about discipling 18 to 30-year-olds, you'll probably know the name John Mark Comer, former pastor of Bridgetown, Oregon. He left to set up Practicing the Way, a global resource to help small groups engage in spiritual disciplines. There are, of course, several trends that this speaks to, not least the influential work of James K. Smith on contemporary liturgical studies, all the artistic origins of the charismatic movement, from which the Wesleyan holiness movement from which the charismatic movement derives. However, a trend that cannot be ignored is that the spiritual disciplines are an objective reality rather than a subjective experience. That they provide a much needed ballast for those whose regular Sunday worship is expressive and emotive, focusing on subjective experience of the objective reality rather than on the objective reality of faith itself. When it comes to the question of participation in church life, or indeed participation in the diocese or a global church, there is a risk that charismatics will define participation as purely a subjective feeling rather than an objective reality. That an individual participates in the life of God to the extent that they feel they are participating in the life of God, that they are part of the community to the extent that they feel part of the community, that they are part of the global church to the extent that they feel it to be true. And what is needed, therefore, is an objective reality, because when illness strikes, or when depression strikes, or when community experiences conflicts, a subjective feelings-based faith does not endure. We need to press into the objective reality. Or, as Simeon Zahl would describe, we need a doctrine that is effectively salient. In his 2015 article in Modern Theology, Zahl uses contemporary psychology and social science to argue that it is only through accepting a particular account of a doctrine and allowing that account to shape our religious practice that people will experience the right sort of emotional outcome in their piety and practice and avoid some problematic emotional outcome. And this, he says, is the effective salience of doctrines, the capacity of doctrines to affect a meaningful change in the believer by the way they work on the emotional life of the believer. And he draws on the example of the Reformation, where he says that both the Tridentines and the Reformers were arguing for different things from the same logic. The Reformers said, unless we preach the doctrine of assurance, then people will not live holy lives. And the Tridentines said, if we preach the doctrine of eternal security, people will not live holy lives. Without wanting to get into why the Reformers were definitely right. They both are arguing from the same logic and the same reasoning. So what might be an effectively salient account of participation? I believe that we find it most powerfully in the sacramental framework. That through baptism we objectively participate in the death and resurrection of Christ, regardless of how much we feel it to be true or not. That in communion we hold on to Christ literally with our hands, literally in our mouths, regardless of whether we feel it to be true or not. The subjective engagement in faith is crucial, something that the turgid nominalism that blights many Anglican parishes fails to see. However, so is the objective truth to which subjective experience responds. If we wish to see many participate in the life and death of Christ and share in the communion of the saints in the Spirit, then we should hold that sacramental worship, along with biblical teaching, should be an indispensable part of every church community. And while time does not allow me to expand on the details, it's notable that several Pentecostal theologians arrive at a similar conclusion, and this has led to a resurgence of sacramental worship in that tradition. In brief then, how can this be done and what must change? How we can. In the short term, I suggest that the solution is quite simple: to increase the number of clergy who can offer sacramental provision in a manner that will serve the style of worship and the manner of community life that is present in lay-led churches. If we're to take this vision of sacramental worship seriously, then we must ensure that churches that send out lay-led church plants have a sufficient number of clergy to provide regular sacramental worship, and that the lay leaders are equipped to speak meaningfully about sacramental theology. This would not work on a we have a priest to visit to do it 3 times a year. I suggest that every parish with a number of lay-led churches should expect another member of clergy afforded to them to meet the sacramental needs of the parish. This would undoubtedly become an oversight role, and the appointment process should reflect the lay-led churches in the parishes which the role will serve. A top-down diocesan appointment which fails to take into account the theological traditions of the lay-led churches or the existing networks to which they're connected, be they New Wine, HDB, Renew, Commission, or any others, would be ill-advised and harmful. That's how we can, in the short term, meet the need. The better question is a long-term answer: what must change? In the long term, we need a total reformation of clergy training. We must admit that the present system is demonstrably failing. The clergy are feeling overworked and ill-equipped for the tasks that they are asked to perform in both volume and type. The churches are shrinking, frequently struggling to find suitable people to serve in essential roles like parish safeguarding officer or treasurer or church warden. Our representation of ethnic minority and younger priests is pitiful. An impartial observer may say that we select the wrong people, we train them in the wrong way, and then we blame them when they fail. We need to move to a model of clergy training which reinstates rigorous doctrinal theology and exegesis, which has too often been displaced by the postmodern fad of theological reflection, and select people to train who have got a track record of leading growth in local churches. In this sense, then, lay-led churches are a gift. When we see a lay leader who is leading a growing church, we should ordain them deacon much more quickly and allow them to serve in the diaconate for a number of years. They'll then be able to baptize new converts promptly and legally. In time, through discernment, there should be provision for them to be ordained priests without leaving their indigenous context or community. This should be a pathway, perhaps in time the main, but not only pathway, to ordination in the coming decade. I believe that the structures that we assume are currently protecting the sacramental life of the church, heavy restriction on orders, are in fact harming it. Our problem is that we are not properly sacramental. The question must be asked to our senior clergy: is the Eucharist important for God's people? If so, then local worshipping communities gathering around lay leaders must be offered this sacramental provision by creating ordination pathways for those already in leadership. And only then will we have solved the participation problem.